All right, good morning, good afternoon, it's noon.
Thank you all for coming and joining us today to talk about doing good with data.
We didn't purposely plan these shirts to match the title of our session, so we were wandering through the Tableau store the other day, and we saw these on display, and we're like, oh my goodness, that's the title of our session, so we went and picked up a few. And if you pick up a few, we now get 10% of every purchase, so thank you very much. I'm joking, we don't. So we're gonna kick things off with a little bit of an imagination session. So I want you to imagine with me that you live somewhere in Texas along the coast, and a big old hurricane comes barreling towards your city. You decide to weather the storm through the night, and when daybreak comes, you realize that you no longer have a house to sleep in. What are you gonna do that day? Wouldn't it be great if there was something you could go to find a place to sleep for you and your kids in the coming days to just make weathering that storm a little bit easier to do?
And imagine or think about an issue that you are really passionate about and the opportunity to effectively communicate the needs of that issue and around that issue to the public and the decision makers who might be able to affect change there.
And what about homelessness? What if we could help a few hundred, a few tens, just any amount of individuals find a place to sleep, a place that would allow them to transition from life on the streets to life, as you and I live it today. So this is the idea behind our session, is we're going to show you a couple of examples in which all of these imaginations, if that's a word, don't actually have to be imaginations. We're going to show you ways that this actually could be done in practice today with Tableau. So welcome to our session. My name is Jeremy Blaney.
My name is Lillian Katz.
And we both work at Tableau. So I'm a strategic customer success manager at Tableau, meaning I work with some of our largest customers to help them really just achieve their data goals with Tableau. I specifically support the United Nations globally. It's a super cool and super humble role because I see on a daily basis the ways in which people throughout the UN are using data analytics and Tableau to do some pretty amazing stuff. Prior to Tableau, I led the diversity and inclusion practice at Bank of America. And prior to all that, I was in the US military for a really long time, deploying around the world in support of humanitarian operations and that kind of thing.
And I'm an enterprise sales representative here. I also work on the global United Nations accounts. I manage the sales relationship and partnership between our two organizations. Prior to Tableau, I worked for a tech startup, but I've always been really passionate about humanitarian issues, and I actually run the philanthropy committee for the Tableau DC office.
Cool.
Great. All right, let's get started. So, what does doing good actually look like? I'm not meaning to be patronizing. I'm sure you guys all have an idea of what doing good actually looks like and feel that you've done good in your communities. But you probably don't have a fully fledged way to measure what doing good actually looks like. And that's what we want to talk some about today. The United Nations has actually laid out a blueprint for us to measure a way to build a more prosperous world through what are called the Sustainable Development Goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, are a collection of 17 goals that were put in place by the United Nations Development Program in 2015. And the goal is to accomplish all of these by 2030. And they include goals to end poverty, protect the planet, gender equality, responsible consumption. You can see these are all pretty broad goals. But behind each of these are a separate list of specific targets, and then behind those different indicators that help us get a little bit more granular and truly measure whether or not we're moving closer to achieving these goals through the whole host of programs that the United Nations and others are doing. So for instance, here is an example of some of the targets and indicators behind no poverty. And these are measured either at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level, or even at the global level. And then these measures might change depending upon how you're measuring that. So for instance, if we're talking about eradicating extreme poverty globally, we're talking about people who live on less than $1.25 a day. But at other places, we might measure it as access to services, land rights, etc. So there's actually a lot that goes behind each of these goals, and that's really important to note because it really truly means that the United Nations is not going to be able to achieve all of these things themselves. And I love this quote from Enrico Giovanni, who is the co-chair of the independent advisory group that helps the UNDP work on the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically around measuring that data. And he talks about how, one, these goals are just so massive themselves, but on top of that, we have so many rapidly changing humanitarian and development challenges that they truly need the help of other institutions to do that. And what's good is that it is happening in some areas. Individuals, universities, other organizations have taken on either one or more of the Sustainable Development Goals to do good and then measure it to see if it's truly sustainable. And actually, even the Tableau Foundation measures their work that they do through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. Moreover, we need good data and good insight to know where the problems are, how to fix them, and then again, are these solutions actually working? This is one thing we hear over and over again in the organizations that we speak with throughout the UN is that they'll put something in place, but it's really hard to measure if it's truly affecting the outcomes that'll help us get closer to these goals. So today we're going to talk about some really specific examples of how you can measure these within your community using Tableau. And more than anything, we really hope that it's a jumping off point where you can maybe take one of these goals or one of these targets within the goals, it's something that you're passionate about, and use it as a jumping off point to really create something for yourself and for your community.
And so we figured the best way to do that would by running through a couple of scenarios, the first of which is when seconds count. So back in 2006, I deployed to the Philippines to support a humanitarian relief operation. Essentially, there had been a mudslide in the Philippine province of Southern Leyte. People were without the basics of survival, food, water, shelter. I was stationed on the mainland in the Philippines at an old US military airfield, and my role in all of this was to coordinate the airlift of these life-saving supplies to that southern region so that way they could get it to those who needed it. This wasn't a particularly easy thing to do. First, we had the logistical challenge in front of us. Logistics quite literally spanned the length of the Philippines, and we required different types of transport to get these supplies from A to B to C. We had to rely on cargo aircraft from A to B, trucks from B to C, and then eventually helicopters to get that final mile. Second, we had to coordinate with multiple agencies, right? I was with the US Air Force at that time, but we were working with people from the Marine Corps and the Navy and the Philippine government and the Red Cross and so many others. Ultimately, in this particular situation, just over 1,000 people died, but thousands more were displaced from this particular mudslide. Unfortunately, situations like this are extremely common in the world in which we live today. Millions in any given year are injured, affected, or simply less homeless by natural disasters that are occurring around the world. Reducing our disaster risk and effectively responding when disasters actually happen, I mean, this is one way that we can accelerate the achievement of the SDGs, but the question is how do we do that given the scope of what we're talking about here? The most obvious answer is to say, well, a lot of disasters are happening. We need all hands on deck to respond to these particular situations, but that's a really difficult thing to do because of a couple of different reasons. First, when you bring together a bunch of organizations together in support of any particular humanitarian operation, you have to realize that organizations, they have their own priorities. Individuals have their own specialties and that kind of thing. Second, each organization has its own IT systems, and these IT systems often aren't linked from one organization to another. So a successful response to all of these humanitarian disasters that are happening around the world, it's not just enough to say, well, we need a lot more people involved in this particular effort to make it a success. We also need all those people to coordinate in some way, shape, or form. We need them to talk about what they're doing, where are they working, what supplies they have on hand, if they have trauma counselors and specialists and that kind of thing as a part of their staff. And that's why the Secretary General sometime last year said that the sharing of data in the middle of these humanitarian emergencies, this is absolutely critical to the successful outcome of these particular situations. And so what I'm going to show you today is a dashboard that was inspired by something I found on Tableau Public that can be used by some of the most critical parties in a humanitarian relief operation as it pertains to hurricane response. In this situation, the two parties that I'm talking about are those who have been affected by the hurricane itself. These people whose livelihood has basically been ripped away, and they need to figure out in a hurry where they need to stay. So that's population number one. And population number two are all those do-gooders out there who haven't been adversely affected, but want to do something. I think everybody would agree here that we're really humbled and just awestruck by those who, after a hurricane or other national disaster, raise their hand and say, hey, I wasn't adversely affected, I want to help out in some way, shape, or form. But it's really important to channel the energies of those people and direct them in some specific way as to how they can help, because otherwise it ends up just being more people in a room when we don't need more people in a room. So let me flip over to this viz. And that's not it. And let me show you this. Give me a second here. Presentation mode. Pro tip, F7 also does that, which I constantly forget, but anyways. So like I said, this dashboard is meant to serve two different populations, those who need shelter and those who just simply want to help. And so what I did is I brought together a data source which is hosted on Google Sheets to basically give those two parties the information that they need right there. So on this dashboard, right up at the top, you see in big bold letters, it says, do I need to only view shelters with availability? And the answer is either yes, it has availability, or no, it doesn't. And the reason that I put that at the very top is because when somebody has just had their house ripped away from them, I don't want them to dig through the dashboard and figure out what they need to click on in order to view where they can particularly sleep that night. So it's defaulted to has availability. And then when we look at the map, we can see that each of these dots is a location, and the location is set to only those that have availability. So if I wanted to hover over here, I can see that a VFW post outside of the city of Houston has availability. They do accept pets. That's pretty great. So, I can see their information right there. Let me call them up and find a place to sleep tonight. I can go a level deeper. If I want to click on this, it'll actually filter some information down here to say, okay, we have 20 spaces available. Yes, they are accepting people because it's already filtered up there. No, they're not accepting pets, or yes, they are accepting pets. For the other group, those who want to help out in some way, shape, or form, we can see down here ways in which they can particularly contribute. So let's say that, like I said, I wasn't negatively affected. I've got a daughter that recently transitioned to potty training successfully, so I've got a bunch of extra diapers on hand. I can now go in here and scroll down and find the place that is right here. They need baby items. They need bottles, spoons, formula, Similac, all this stuff to support the kids that are coming to their particular shelter. I can now click on this, and up above, it filters to that location. I can hover over it, see where it is, give them a call, reach out, and say, I have some stuff. Let me pass that along to you. At the same time, down here, let's say I have a particular skill and I want to make use of that skill for the benefit of others in this situation. I began my professional career when I was 16 bagging groceries, as many people did, so I'm very good at packing boxes. I can scroll down and see, I'm sure something in here that will allow me to make use of those skills in some way, shape, or form. And just like the above worksheet, I can click here and it filters to that location over here. We need to keep this information up to date. Obviously, stale information is bad information, particularly when seconds do count. And so what I did is I embedded the Google Sheet that is feeding this particular dashboard right on the dashboard itself. So if I wanted to go a level deeper, I could actually click here and have this information auto-populate up here so I could go and update that information. I didn't build that into this particular dashboard. The way that I set it up is that any organization can now go in, provide their information, click submit at the bottom, and this information will be updated up here. This is just one really, really simple way in which people can use Tableau to after a disaster strikes to find their way to a shelter or find some way to contribute for those who are in need after disaster strikes. And there are a lot of other examples, real-life examples out there about people who are leveraging data, analytics, and Tableau in these time-critical situations. So in 2017, when Hurricane Harvey struck, a web developer in San Francisco basically created a web app that leveraged Tableau to share crowdsourced information on individuals who needed to be saved from their homes because of rising floodwaters and that kind of thing. Another organization that leverages Tableau when responding to humanitarian crises is NetHope, which is a Tableau Foundation grantee. As you can imagine, just as I said before, when disaster strikes, there definitely is a data scramble to find relevant information on how many buildings were in this location, how many people lived in those buildings, and that kind of thing. In 2016, an earthquake struck in Ecuador, and some 20,000 people were affected. NetHope and Tableau partnered together to basically create this single source of truth. It was a dashboard about just everything that was going on in that particular area, so that way all the relief agencies that were a part of that mission could have their efforts better guided.
Great. We're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the story behind data, or advocating with data. So I mentioned in my little introduction that I lead the philanthropy committee out of the DC office, and each quarter we work on a specific SDG, whether that be through fundraisings for a specific cause, a donation drive, volunteer events, all to work on targets of the SDGs within the Washington, D.C. community. So for these programs, we put up posters, I send out emails, and these are great for the people who look and open them at creating some interest. Usually they come, ask some more questions, but it definitely still leaves this emotional distance from the problem that we're working on, and still this inability to drive further down and ask some questions for themselves about the issue that we're working on. So I started to think about this a little bit more as I was creating the dashboard for this section, and I started to pull some data on the Syrian refugee crisis. So this is something that we hear a lot about, working with the United Nations. I felt like I knew this topic pretty well, but as I was creating the initial version of my dashboard, which you can see up here on the right-hand side, it's great. It gives me a really good sense of what's happening with the crisis at scale. It duplicates a lot of the things that are done on some others are doing successfully with Tableau to respond and advocate for crises. But again, I didn't feel an emotional connection to this dashboard. It's really hard to picture 5.6 million refugees, right? Like, how can I connect with that? So I put it away for a while, opened up Instagram, and stumbled upon a Humans of New York post. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with Humans of New York, but it's a photographer based out of New York who takes pictures of those around the city, and then there's a caption that's in the person's own words, usually about some aspect of their life story. And I went into the account, started perusing through and looking at some of the comments, and I was really amazed by what kind of emotions and what kind of response those things were evoking. It was amazing to see how many fundraisers were set up for people who were going through something who were pictured, how many people commented and just had this sort of realization about a problem maybe they didn't know about before, or maybe they'd seen on the news, but again, there had been this distance between themselves and that issue at hand. And that then brought me to the next iteration of my dashboard, where again, I'm still trying to say, why should I care? How should I help? What's the overall issue here? Bringing in that human element. Switch over. All right, so here's my new dashboard. So I've still got a lot of the same stuff that I created before. It's still interactive. I can hover over, see how many refugees are in specific countries. I can see there are currently 3.4 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, which is an astounding amount. But I can also scroll down, and please bear with me, I'm not a graphic designer, as you can obviously see. I'm happy to take your tips afterwards on how I can make this a lot prettier. But then I can also hover over these data points in a sort of Humans of New York fashion to see the stories of specific refugees and to look at truly who are the people being affected by this crisis. How can I emotionally connect to them? What's their story? And make it more than just a number, because I know that's really, really easy to do. And then hover over here, just what action you can take afterwards. In this case, I just put a donation link, and you can hover over and see what your donation does each month. And I want to stress that I'm not advocating for less posters or less dashboards that are truly number-driven, because we really need those for effective decision making. But when we're trying to motivate people to take action on something, we need to think a little bit more creatively about the ways that we're mobilizing people. And it's something we talk a lot about to the UN and the UN affiliates that we work with, that we can't hand people a 65-page PDF report that just has a bunch of bar charts and expect them to make something out of that and take action there. And I hope this is something that you guys can then take and maybe replicate, again, about an issue that you're passionate about, or help a nonprofit that's working on an issue that you're passionate about. And so just like Jeremy said with the emergency response, this is happening in some places. And a lot of it's done around disaster relief, actually, looking at fundraising for disaster relief, giving this information to stakeholders that can do that drilling down into data themselves, or even information that's just given to the general public in that same fashion with a story behind it to help mobilize some of the efforts, whether it's actual bodies on the ground or monetary donations.
All right. And this very last section is called When Rows Aren't Enough. So what if I were to provide you with a few Excel workbooks, each of which contain a few worksheets? The data probably doesn't begin on row 1, it probably begins on like row, I don't know, 40 and column Z, something goofy like that, and ask you to help me understand homelessness in the United Kingdom and ultimately what I can do to help bring an end to homelessness in the United Kingdom. I think your approach would probably look like one of two different paths. Either A, you'd start to bring everything together using VLOOKUPs and index matches and access, or some sort of unholy combination of all of those things. Or you'd open up a bunch of windows and start, cross-referencing things yourself on one screen, another screen, color coding here and there, and making sense of this beautiful disaster before you. Either way, it's a pretty monumentous task, one that's not too different from this. So imagine that each grid here contains relevant information about homelessness. One is actually about homelessness itself, how many people are living on the streets in X, Y, or Z country or city. Another presents some information about shelters that are available. How many beds are available at those shelters, how many shelters are open today, that kind of thing. Let's say the third contains some information on homelessness eradication schemes that have been done in the past, what's worked, what hasn't worked, etc. Basically, each of these grids contains a piece to this particular puzzle, and we need the complete picture if we're going to move forward both efficiently and effectively. So taking a look at these grids, I'd like you to answer two different questions. One, how do these grids differ, or how are they similar? And then two, how many 9s are in each grid? Now this task, it's not impossible, right? Like, you could do it with enough time. You could go through row by row, column by column, and make your way through all this information and give me the answer that I'm looking for, but time is a luxury when it comes to the SDGs that we can't afford. We talked about humanitarian disaster, and there it's really clear that seconds do matter because people's lives are quite literally on the line, and we need to move fast. Otherwise, we may reach an outcome that is truly unfortunate. But what about homelessness? Sure, it's not in front of us 24/7. We're not seeing it on the news in the way that we would, a hurricane that's just hit the United States. But that doesn't mean that we should be any less motivated to act extremely fast to help people find shelter, to help enroll them in transition programs, because, like Lillian said, each of these data points is a story. Each of these data points connects to a real live human being. So with a bit of color, now you can tell me how these grids are different or how they're similar. The font is a little small, so it still might take a little bit of time, but the answer at least is much more clear. And this is the end state that we're trying to get to when it comes to tackling the SDGs. These issues are incredibly complicated and can't just be answered through the use of one Excel or 2 worksheets in a single workbook. We need to look at these things through the lens of multiple data sets, bringing them together to try to tackle these problems. Now, this question about homelessness in the UK, this is one that Chloe Tsing asked earlier this year of her global community of volunteers. Chloe runs an organization called the Viz for Social Good campaign, which hopefully many of you got the chance to learn a little bit about earlier this week. I think on Monday she did a quick presentation. The Viz for Social Good campaign partners with do-good organizations such as UNICEF, UNDP, and others to take on a social challenge of sorts. I'll tell everybody a bit more about this organization as we get to the tail end of this presentation. But for this project, she partnered with an organization called Tomorrow Today, which has that lofty goal to bring awareness to and an end to homelessness in the United Kingdom. Tomorrow Today, when she partnered with this organization, provided the data set on sleepers, that's the term they use in the UK, as well as vacant dwellings in the UK, basically homes or buildings that are abandoned. Chloe then provided this information to her global community of volunteers, and this global community of volunteers basically created these visualizations that helped Tomorrow Today achieve that very lofty mission. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip over to an example of, click the wrong button, sorry about that. Oh, maybe not. One more. Thanks. So here it is. We have a viz that I created in support of this particular initiative, right? And you can see a couple of things are going on here. Over to the left, we can see some information just about homelessness in the United Kingdom and the fact that it's up 100% since 2010. This data set cuts off at 2015. That's pretty wild. If we look at the most recent year of data, we can see that there are 3,500 rough sleepers in the United Kingdom, but this is where we start to get this other information, that there are 2,002 vacant public sector dwellings. Like I said, think of a vacant dwelling as basically an abandoned building, right? I don't know much about these buildings. I don't know how big they are, how small they are, how livable they are for that matter. But what I do know is that from these 2 very simple pieces of data, I'm left with an idea, and that idea is, could we take some of these vacant dwellings and repurpose them as shelters for sleepers? Like I said, a lot I don't know, but I still have that very basic idea. And so what I did is I decided to at least put a little bit of meaning to that idea to see what would our impact be if we wanted to pursue this a little bit more. And so step 1 in that effort was to figure out how many sleepers could we house in a repurposed dwelling. And I went with the number 6 right here. I could easily change that to 10 or whatever else. It's just a quick parameter. And by doing that, the map goes ahead, it renders here to show me the areas where we could possibly convert, basically by doing a little bit of math, figuring out where there's a lot of dwellings, where there's a lot of sleepers. We're able to figure out that, okay, we might be able to repurpose some buildings down here, over to the west, and so on and so forth. by just doing a little bit of math there, we can then see that if we were to repurpose all those dwellings and have them be a place where people could live, then we would have 273 less sleepers in the United Kingdom. It's a really simple dashboard that is built on a whole lot of assumptions. I'm totally aware of that, but it begins to just imagine a world in which we start to make some sort of an impact on 1 people, 2 people, 10 people, or in this case, 273 people. Oh, sorry. Let me flip over here. Everybody heard about, okay, there we go. I don't need to, here I plan to tell you the wonderful story of PATH and how they're eliminating malaria in the southern province of Zambia. And obviously I don't need to tell people about that story because they heard about it yesterday. It really is one of the most amazing stories, and I know really just inspires us to do the work that we do with the United Nations today. But the stuff that we're talking about, bringing together these disparate data sets that are absolutely needed to solve a particular problem, this is what we see all the time.
Cool. So, where do we go from here? One place I want to encourage you to start is, again, going back to the work that the United Nations is doing, again, going back to that framework that they've provided with the SDGs. If you're looking for data sets to maybe start on this journey yourself, as Atifa Riazi, who is one of the CIO of the United Nations, says, the United Nations holds a massive, massive amount of data on the world and everything that's going on with it. And they are working harder to open this information up to the public so that you can start using it. And you can start helping them and the other institutions that are working on these things move the world in the right direction. So I really hope that you can take that opportunity and use it and show them that those maybe outside of the development sector who only spend their lives thinking about this thing are also passionate and willing to help with these issues.
And there's this few specific ways that you can get involved as well. So the Viz for Social Good campaign, I can't rave enough about that. It's one very simple, easy way for you to get plugged into the social good space. Again, Chloe does all the work. She finds the project, she finds the data set. You go online, you get involved, and you provide your visualization back to Chloe by publishing it up to Tableau Public and sending her the link. One very simple way to get involved that has a huge impact. The Tableau Service Corps as well, our Tableau Foundation relies on a global community of volunteers to do some pretty amazing stuff when it's needed most. So after a hurricane, after natural disasters, we reach out to people and say, hey, are you able to help in X, Y, or Z way? Usually that's sort of like based on the skill sets that you tell us that you have when you join the Service Corps, but I would really encourage you to do that kind of stuff. And then the other thing that you could do is just help us out. So we support the UN on a global basis. We host webinars for people who are both at headquarters and out in the field. We do visathons, hackathons, and just connect people within the UN to people outside the UN who are interested in sharing how they're using data analytics and Tableau in the private sector space. Just a couple of weeks ago, we got a request from the Department of Peacekeeping Operations to help them build a dashboard that visualizes how the UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti is going. And the thought process is, if it's going well, the Security Council will they will have the mission end next summer, and if things aren't going well, then the peacekeeping mission will extend just a little bit longer. Certainly, Lillian and I, we can host these visathons, but what we want to do is bring people like you who are interested in doing something a little bit bigger than yourself. We want to bring you into the fold and having you participate in these initiatives as well. So if you're interested in this kind of stuff, definitely see us after, and we will be more than happy to take you up on your offer. So.
And I sat in, or both Jeremy and I sat in On Monday, the United Nations Foundation had a whole session for their grantees throughout all of Monday, and I can't stress enough how much this came up in their presentations, the Service Corps, and then just these other opportunities for mentorship. I think if this is something that you are open to, people on the other side are absolutely open to it as well, and so please get in touch, please work with Viz for Social Good and the Service Corps, because there really is a huge need there, and there's some opportunities to impact things that are really high stakes. So, thank you.
And that's it for today. Do you have any questions? Yes. It's a great question, and it's one that we'll have to bring back to the Tableau Foundation. There are some different ways in which that you can get a Tableau license if you're doing some nonprofit work through TechSoup, for example. I think you get a year's free of a Tableau license, and then you just have to re-up every single year. So that's one specific way. In terms of folks who work for maybe like a private sector organization that are interested in helping out, I would say let's chat afterwards, and I'll give you my card, and we'll see what we can do there.
Thanks.
And Tableau Public, yeah. Yeah, and Tableau Public as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, the question was, there's a lot of situations in which, some work is being done internationally, and then the individuals who maybe are doing that work internationally leave, and nothing is made of it, nothing's updated. That's basically it, right? Yeah. And I think this is one of the many questions that we're trying to tackle right now. I mean, we run into issues where individuals are in the field. We host these webinars that are designed to teach some skills, so that way we and Zen Masters don't have to go over to, I'm going to Kenya in a couple of weeks, for example. So we're trying to say that we don't necessarily want to go there and teach. We want to teach them, so that way they can build their own self-sustaining community of users. That's easy-ish to do in a place like Nairobi, which has strong internet access, but as you move into the field, that becomes more difficult to do. People can't join WebExes and that kind of thing. So there are some organizations out there who have some pretty innovative approaches to like low bandwidth training. Lee Feinberg's organization, I'm blanking on the name of the
blanking on it too, and
organization.
any other time I could remember it.
501c3. I can't remember. It's driving me nuts. See my card afterwards.
Yeah.
But so I mean, that's one specific idea. I think the other, I'm big on community building. I'm big on like capacity building, and we can't solely rely on us to go over and do all these things. We have to do that there locally.
And I think you bring up a really good point that, quite frankly, hasn't really been talked about until maybe the past 3 to 5 years. Or at least not on a large level. And so I think there are still so many proof of concepts in play right now for us to know what that really looks like, and so much of it just depends on the issue itself. But I actually think even just looking at some of the work that the foundation's doing with PATH and how they've gotten to the point where they've reduced deaths by malaria by 90% in the provinces in which they're working, but they're not going to stop that data gathering after they've reached that point, right? How do we continue to make sure that that's monitored? And again, by the people on the ground there who are functioning and invested more in those communities, so that we can make sure that those solutions are actually sustainable. I don't think there's an absolute answer yet. I think it's really good that you're asking that question, because I think it's something that a lot of not-for-profits and a lot of foundations need to think about a little bit more.
I will make a plug for this event that we're doing in Nairobi on November 12th. If anybody is doing work with those either in Kenya or in region that are interested in coming to this event, essentially we're calling it the Kenya Day for Data. It's going to run from about 9 to 5, and we're bringing over some Zen masters to do a whole day's worth of discovering what's possible with this data in this data space when it comes to humanitarian reasons. And then we're also ending the day with some skills building sessions. So we're going to talk about, how to do some basics in Tableau, connect to data, build some vizzes, that kind of stuff. We're also going to talk to people about how you could actually build vizzes, build dashboards of use and value and that kind of thing. So this is going to be held at the UN headquarters in Nairobi. So if anybody's interested, has folks over there, or even in
fly
region,
to Nairobi,
or if you want to come to Nairobi with me, by all means, come on out. So.
Can I do a shameless plug?
Shameless plug.
I'm starting the chapter in Atlanta for Biz for Social Good.
Cool.
Awesome.
I teach at Georgia College, and I have a lot of students. And I do projects with my students all the time, where I match them up to a problem, pick a country that's good for them to study that problem, get them outside of the U.S., look somewhere else, and then I try and link them up with somebody in country through LinkedIn, because they can ask questions about that country. And I would love for anybody who wants to join in, let me know. You can find me on the Biz for Social Good, the Atlanta chapter. The students are great. You get some ideas you don't have time for. You give them to these students, and they run with it.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Agreed.
Even though they're undergrads, be surprised what they can come up with.
Yeah.
The Biz for Social Good is great.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't say enough about it. Yeah.
So you guys talk about the UN with all this data. Were they trying to make that open source, or what's kind of the plan for that going forward?
It depends. It depends on who's providing the data. And so a lot of the things that the UN organizations are gathering themselves are usually open publicly. Typically, almost any organization, you could just type in data dot and then the rest of their URL, and you'll go to a page that is just data sets. I know, for instance, that the World Bank and the IMF do just that. And they have an enormous compilation of different data sets, and then even some examples of some vizzes, oftentimes in Tableau, that employees there have made. The other side is if data is being collected by a country itself, by the government of that country, they're not often as willing to share that data. Sometimes it doesn't always look very good for them. So it really just depends on who's gathering it more than anything else. But there definitely is a push, I think, to make a lot more of that open source. And just a few years ago, you wouldn't have been able to get much of anything.
I can think of one exchange that's been really popular or really impactful. That's humanitarian data exchange. That's where a lot of organizations like OCHA and such dump their data so that way multiple agencies can make use of it. I mean, I think the goal, the creme de la creme, would be this massive open data exchange, which every UN organization would feed stuff into, but not there yet.
Anything else? Well, great.
Cool.
We'll give you 15 minutes back.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, guys.